Hello everyone, I'm Tajinder Sidhu and welcome you all in the official channel of Dr. Raghavendra Jha. Doctor, welcome in the first interview session.
Thank you very much.
I would like to just give a brief introduction about yourself, your works and your subject and all the journey that you have gone through. And can you please explain a little bit about yourself to our listeners?
Thank you very much, Tajinder, and welcome all to my YouTube channel. Yes, I'm an economist. I'm a professor of economics currently at the Australian National University and executive director of the Australia South Asia Research Centre here. My academic journey began in 1970 when I was admitted to do the BA Honours course in St. Stephen's College in Delhi University in economics. So I did my graduation from there and then went on to the Delhi School of Economics to do my master's. And finally, after that, in 1975, I finished my master's. And in 1975, I went to Columbia University in the United States, New York, and for my PhD. And there I worked with one of the most distinguished economists in the world ever. His name is Professor Edmund S. Phelps. He was my PhD supervisor. He's the 2006 Nobel laureate in economics. So I was very fortunate to be taught by him, to be supervised by him. And I basically specialized in economic theory, particularly in public finance and in macroeconomics. I taught at Columbia for a year and a half and then went to Williams College in Massachusetts in the United States. And there I taught for 3 years. And after that, I was very keen to come back to India to work in India. So I went to the Delhi School of Economics and was there from 1983 to 1992. In between, I went to Queen's University in Canada and taught there for 2 years, 1989 and 1990. And then again, I went to Canada in January 93, and I taught there until July 94. After which I came back to India because I again wanted to return to India, and I taught at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, for a year. After which I went to University of Warwick in the United Kingdom, taught there for a year, and from there I went to the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research in Mumbai. And I came to Australia in 2001 from the Indira Gandhi Institute. So I have traveled a fair bit in the world and taught in various universities in the world. I basically work on public finance and macroeconomics and welfare, social welfare programs. My country's specialty is India. I've taught public finance and macroeconomics in all these universities and also specialized courses in India, on India. I have published quite well, if I may say so. Several dozen books and more than 150, almost 200 papers in scientific journals and other refereed outlets. I've consulted widely for organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, and several, the ADB and several others, and supervised several PhD students, some of whom are doing very well for themselves in their own careers. So that is a short introduction to myself.
That's great. Seems like it's been a really interesting journey to you.
It has been, yes.
Serving
Yes.
different countries and various cultures,
Yes.
so
Yes.
this is very good.
Yes.
All right, Doctor, so we will start today's interview session.
Right.
And I would like to ask you first question that there is no dearth of books, scholarly and popular, on India. Then why did you write these volumes and what are these volumes about?
So
I think it should be fine. We will chop it up in the editing here. That's good.
Yes.
So we can maybe leave it on, and you want to take a break, or you just
No, no,
ready to go?
no.
Okay, so we'll go for the next one. Yeah, leave it on like that. Yeah,
We'll just
yeah,
leave it.
yeah. We'll just go from there. All right, Doctor. Very interesting. So next thing I would like to ask you: can you please provide an overview of the chapter in the volume 1? Because as you said, it's been a really a wider range that you cover in this volume. So can you please provide an overview, so what you're trying to cover, and what was your objectives, and what your research is all about?
That's also finished.
Okay, all right, yeah. So the next one, okay, sorry, that was finished. Some talking about this one, is it?
Right.
No, I
Please
think
provide
overview. Yeah. Okay. So we'll go on. All right, Doctor. That's very interesting. Can you please provide an overview of the chapter in the volume 1?
Yes, so let's look at volume 1. The first chapter, as I said, was it deals with India's GDP, India's gross domestic product, which is a measure of the output that the country produces right from the time that records have been kept. So the Dutch economist Angus Madison has done a very good job of compiling countries' GDPs since the year 0 AD, going back all that way. And in the year 0 AD, India's share of the world GDP was 32.9%. I would like to emphasize that. India was such a rich country. India's GDP, share of world GDP was 32.9%. By contrast, China's was 26.2%.
All right.
Much lower than India's. But then, if you look at the start of the Mughal period, say 1500, India had started slipping under Muslim rule, and India's share of world GDP was now only 24.5%. And then the Chinese GDP had come on level with India about 25%. In 1700, which we can take as a mark of the beginning of British rule, because Aurangzeb died in 1707, and then the British started making inroads into India. India's share of world GDP was still quite high, 24.4%, as compared to China's 22.3%. But then it started to slip very badly. Okay, so with the result that in 1950, India's share in world GDP was only 4.2%. So we came down from 32.9% to 4.2%, and China's came down from 26.2% to 4.5%. So prior to the Mughal rule, or Muslim rule in India, not Mughal rule, or even Mughal rule, if you may want to say so, India was literally the best, the richest country in the world. In Hindi they say Sone ki chiriya. It really was that. The economic figures bring that out. And then it started to slip in 1500. The Mughal Empire started in 1526 with Babur, and then slipped further in 1700 with the onset of British rule in India. It recovered from 4.2% to 5% in 1990 by 1998. So even now, India's share of world GDP, although rising, is not very high. So the chapter discusses why all these changes have. The chapter 1 discusses why all these changes have occurred. It also discusses the structure of output in India, the fact that agriculture has, the share of agriculture has steadily gone down in terms of output, but it has not gone down very much in terms of share of the population. The share of the population dependent on agriculture is still very high, although the share of output coming from agriculture is now much lower than before. It discusses that, and it discusses issues related to the the fragmentation of land holdings and agricultural productivity and the fall of agricultural productivity, particularly land productivity in India. Okay, so the key problem that India has faced is that it has not grown fast enough. So I give a table in the book which is very illustrative, which is that if you look at the per capita GDP in 1895 as percentage of the per capita GDP in 2006. So if the per capita GDP in 1895 is a very small fraction of the per capita GDP in 2006, then it means that between 1895 and 2006, the country has grown very fast. But if that fraction is large, then it means that the country has grown very slowly. So in the case of China, it was 3.36% only. So China has grown very fast. In the case of France, it is 11%. In the case of Germany, it is 15.7%. In the case of India, it is 20.44%. So India's GDP in 2006, GDP per capita in 2006 was only 5 times the India's GDP in 1995, whereas China's was 33 times. So similarly, it says that the key problem that India faces is that over a very long period of time, it has not grown very fast. Its economy needs to grow very fast, and the economy, the policymakers and all economists must concentrate on India's growth, or to the exclusion of almost everything. So it does that, and then it also shows the policy challenges that exist in order to increase India's GDP growth and ensure that India attains at least upper middle income standard by 2050 or so, according to the World Bank's classification. Now the next chapter, chapter 2, it talks about land, labor and population in India. Now I don't want to talk too much about this chapter, or for that matter any chapter, because that would take us far too long. But I'll give you some important characteristics of India's population development. So India's population began being counted in the late 19th century. And India's first census was in 1881, and then it has continued unabated till 2011, which is the latest census. So a couple of things about that first census, the first 2 censuses actually are important, worth noting here. The first thing is that the census commissioner at that time, the British gentleman who was the census commissioner at that time, was working in South Africa before he came to India. Whereas at that time there was apartheid in South Africa. So he was used to thinking in terms of people as being genetically different from each other. So he introduced the concept of caste in the Indian census for the first time. Now, as every Indian knows, there is no such thing as caste in India. We have varnas and we have jatis within varnas. We don't have caste. The caste is a term which came from the first census of India. And we thought that these castes were genetically different, which of course is nonsense. So this is one thing I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say is that people talk about the large population in India, but there have been periods in India when India's population has actually fallen. For example, between 1901 and 1911, there were so many famines that India's population was actually falling. And another thing I wanted to talk about in the context of India is that the population of different religions has grown very differently. Okay, so after partition, the proportion of Muslims in the populations of Pakistan and Bangladesh have gone up very sharply. They are almost completely Muslim nations. Whereas the population of Hindus in India and Indian religions, not just Hindus, Indian religions, that is Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, and Jainism, religions that have been born in India, the shares of these religions have actually come down a little bit. And in 2011, there was a psychological change in when the share of the Hindu population came below the 80% mark in India. So they are less than 80%, 79 point something percent Hindus in India. So that's religious composition has changed. Then the chapter talks a fair bit about the demographic transition in India. The families are those which are poor. Okay, so the poor people have more children than richer people, and as India has progressed, the share of the poor in the population has risen precisely because of this demographic factor. Okay, so rich people have valued their time more, so they have fewer children, whereas the poor people have more children. That is one thing. Another thing I wanted to talk about in this session is the important role of gender bias in India. Okay, the fact that over time the share of girls in the child population has fallen, and in 2011 there were fewer than 900 girls between the ages of 0 and 6 for every 1,000 boys, which is a very concerning thing. This is the gender bias in India's population, and I show that this is largely true of the richer classes, upper and middle income classes. So the gender bias is mainly occurring in the upper strata of society, not among the poor. So this is an important thing. So as India grows rich, it has to and it wants to challenge its gender composition of its population, which is very important because otherwise there will be massive social problems. So it has to address this fact that as people grow richer, they become more and more biased towards having sons rather than daughters. So this is something which I have talked about in this chapter as well. So that be chapter 2. then I go to chapter 3. In chapter 3, I talk about human development indicators in India. Now, let me give you a sense of where India was at the time of independence. The life expectancy in India at the time of independence was only 34 years. The average Indian used to die at the age of 34. Just imagine how poor the country was. 34 was the average life expectancy in India, and all other social indicators like infant mortality, that the rate at which infants between the ages of 0 and 1 die, child mortality, maternal mortality, that is the death of women at the time of childbirth, all these were very high. The incidence of various diseases were very high, and so on. So, and from there we have come a very long way. The life expectancy is now well above 65 in India, and infant mortality has come down sharply. Child mortality has come down sharply. Maternal mortality has also come down sharply. Incidence of various diseases have come down sharply. So all these factors are there. So India's Human Development Indicator Index has climbed from about 0.36. One is the highest that you can reach on the Human Development Indicator Index. The Human Development Indicator Index, let me explain, is a combination of GDP per capita and educational attainment and health attainment. So it combines these three things in a convenient way. So that has improved from about 0.36 to more than 0.62, 63 in about 50 years or so. So India has made substantial progress, but it is not among the best performing middle income countries as yet. So that is a brief overview of chapter 3. So India is making progress. Development is occurring during the post-independence period, and India is poised to improve its living standards even further. And it's particularly important because India is such a youthful country with the median age of the population about 27, 28. So more than 600 million people are below the age of 28 in India. So they should better have better health, they should better have good health, good education in order to propel the economy to greater heights in the future. So these are some of the things which are discussed in chapter 3. Now let me look very briefly at chapter 4. This is an account of how various invaders came to India, lured by its great prosperity. We have just talked about that, prosperity, and in the case of Muslims also, apart from the prosperity, to convert people. So this was the two basic motivations that came. So the chapter discusses various attacks, and it's not true that India didn't put up a resistance. For hundreds of years, Indians did put up resistance, but then internal disunity cost India very dear, and it lost the native population lost control over the country and the economy. It discusses the onset of Mughal rule, starting with Babur, and it also discusses the inroads that these people tried to make into southern India. It also spent some time discussing about the economic policies of the Mughals, and in particular, it says that the Mughals, the expansion of the Mughal Empire, was largely financed by an increase in taxes on farmers. So if you talk about the great achievements of the Mughals, if some people talk about quote-unquote great achievements of the Mughals, they should realize that it was based on the earnings of farmers who were very poor at that time. Land tax went up considerably during British rule, during Mughal rule. This was stated by none less than Henry Carey, who was the chief economic advisor of President Lincoln at that time. And I have mentioned Henry Carey's work on the Mughals in India in this chapter. Now, chapter 5, which is the impact of British rule, there was a that looks at three things. So as I said earlier, it looks at prosperity. The decline of prosperity, the manufacturing sector, agriculture, and so on. Some few aspects of the Indian economy during that period. So let me just talk a little bit about that. So the great queen of Indore and other areas, Ahilyabai Holkar, who's people in the audience would know her name. She wrote in 1772 to the Peshwas that Peshwas in Maharashtra, that the Indians had made a fundamental mistake in understanding the British, because they thought, the Indians had thought that the British were like other people who came and looted and went away when there was no central power, and there was no central power after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707. But the mistake was to think that they would simply loot and go away. They were here to stay and do and change Indian economy fundamentally, Indian economy and society fundamentally. So, as I said earlier, before the British rule came to India, Europe had hardly anything to sell to India. India used to make some fantastic textiles, famous all over the world, and Europe had hardly anything to sell to India. However, when the British rule came, things started to change very fast. India, which was almost accounted for almost a quarter of world manufacturing before the British came to India, almost a quarter of world manufacturing before the British came to India, came down to almost 2% by the end of British rule. So this is the impact that your trade policy is a trade policy of encouraging cotton exports from India and import of Lancashire textiles into India. That is what they did. That this is what it did to the industrial sector, manufacturing sector. Then the chapter talks a little bit about economic drain. And economic drain is the surplus that they used to have from their operations in India, and they would transfer them to Britain. And there's an example of an early instance of this drain in the 1740s from Bengal, and so the excess of East India Company earnings over their expenditures was thought of as drain, and even as far back in the 1740s, tens of millions of pounds were taken away from India as in that period in the 1740s. So that is discussed, and then finally the chapter also discusses agricultural policy. Now, this is terribly important. Agricultural policy, Britain had a policy of deliberately neglecting Indian agriculture. They wanted resources from Indian agriculture in terms of taxes, but they wanted to neglect it. Why did they want to neglect it? I think that is terribly important. Henry Carey, whom I just mentioned, who was the chief economic advisor of Abraham Lincoln, President Abraham Lincoln, has put it very well. He said that the British wanted cheap labor for building the railways in India. And people in India, it was not very populated at that time. People in India were very attached to the land, so they would not move from the land unless they were forced to leave the land. And what was the technique that the British used to enforce this? Well, they neglected agriculture, completely neglected agriculture, taxed the farmers very heavily, as a consequence of which there were huge famines in India. During British rule in India, more than 52 million people died because of famines. This is not all the deaths. This is deaths over and above the normal. We should understand that this is not all the deaths that occurred during this period. Many people die because of normal reasons. But there's a technical definition of what is a death from a famine, and more than 52 million people have died because of the famines. So these famines then forced the farmers to leave the land and go and work on the railways.
Mm.
So this is how the railways
Mhm.
was established in India. So this is one of the principal
Mhm.
reasons they got the labor very cheap,
Mhm.
almost free labor. So these people were desperate to do, they would do anything to make their ends meet, and they would go and work on the railways. And more than that, apart from the famines, there is this disease, genetic disease called Kwashiorkor, which is engineered by exposure to famines. What happens is that if a person lives through many famines, then they develop a genetic condition called Kwashiorkor, and this, what it does is that it stunts people.
Mm.
It makes people shorter than they should be.
Mm.
This is a technical term in nutrition analysis, and it is very important because there are well-established results. The shorter people, everything else, controlling for everything else, I must emphasize this over and over again, controlling for everything else, shorter people are less productive than taller people, and therefore earn lower wages. And this condition called Kwashiorkor is passed on from one generation to the next. So if you see the World Bank saying, oh, Indian children are very stunted, they are not tall enough, to go back to this phenomenon during British rule. It has its roots there. So this should be understood by people all over the world. Right? So so there are deep historical roots for these things, and in fact Henry Carey says this very emphatically about the incidence of famines in India. Okay, so that's chapter 5. So chapter 6, I'll be very sorry. Chapter 6 is the India's quest for freedom. So India's quest for freedom. This is India, of course, was ruled. It is a folly to think that India was always a divided country. It was not. There were long periods of time, which are discussed in the book, where India's geographic size was larger than it is today, was larger than it was during British times, larger than it was during the time of Aurangzeb, which during and at Aurangzeb's during Aurangzeb's reign, the Mughal Empire reached its maximum size. So for many centuries, India was a large geographical entity, but more importantly, India was always culturally united. Okay, so if you go to any part of the country, at any function, the same Sanskrit mantras are repeated, chanted, though the rituals may be slightly different. But this is an amazing thing. This is not something that you can ignore very easily. So this is so cultural unity was always there, but there's a famous statement by Thomas Macaulay, which has been repeated in the book, discussed in the book, which is that India's cultural unity had to be challenged if the British were to rule India. Because India was such an evolved civilization that it was not going to be possible to rule India simply by force. Its cultural unity had to be challenged, and Indians had to be taught to basically look down upon themselves and think that everything European was good and everything Indian was bad. This is the message that was sought to be delivered. So this is what they started doing when they took over. They started taking away surplus from India, and they started making India culturally unsure of itself. And then I discussed the uprisings in the 18th century, and I discussed in detail the 1857 uprising, which is sometimes called the First Indian War of Independence, but was not the first, as I said earlier. Then I discussed the massive dismay that had set into India at the end of the 1857 uprising, because Indians thought that they could never beat the British. They had risen in challenge, and they had been defeated. And they had been defeated essentially again because of the old reason, which is that they were disunited. Not everybody participated. Some of the local kings actually favored the British. They were disunited, and they didn't have enough money. They were not financed properly. That's why they lost the 1857 uprising. So then they lost confidence in themselves. Indians lost confidence in themselves, and the confidence raising began with the work of, he was not alone, but began with the work of Ramakrishna Paramahans and Swami Vivekananda. If you read their works, you will realize, and their activities, you will realize that they infused in Indians a sense of pride in their culture, nothing violent about it at all, in fact very highly spiritual and inward looking, but they said that okay, we are not nothing. We are a substantial people. We have an ancient civilization, and which is worth preserving. So this is what they taught. And then Mahatma Gandhi, of course, Swami Vivekananda remains an inspiration even today. But Mahatma Gandhi took up that idea when he came to India, and he thought that Indians need to be. Mahatma Gandhi, if you remember, was not just a leader of the masses, but was also a deeply religious and spiritual person. Unlike many of the Congress rulers, he was a deeply religious and spiritual person. So his quest for India's independence or India's Indian self-worth, was not separated from his religious pursuit, but the part and parcel of the same thing. And his religiosity was a very tolerant religiosity. It wasn't being imposed on anybody. He was not discriminating against anybody. And he started he didn't start. There were people earlier than him, people like Gokhale and others who worked for India's independence. So I discuss Gandhi's work, and then I discuss the Khilafat movement, Mahatma Gandhi's support to the Khilafat movement, and India's participation in the First World War, where tens of thousands of Indians died on the battlefields of Europe, and the Indians for the first time, in a long time, learned to fight together and defeat Europeans, which was unthinkable in India. Another thing that happened around just before that time was the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, where the Japanese defeated the Russians. And that instilled in Indians a sense that, okay, an Asian power can defeat a European power. Prior to that, Indians used to think that Asians could not defeat Europeans. Europeans were superior people; they could not be defeated. But when India participated so willingly in the First World War, the British press thought there's a citation from one of the British newspapers in my book. British press thought that okay, India will take some compensation for its help to Britain during the First World War. And indeed, in 1916, President Wilson of the United States had assured India that if they participated in the Indians, that if they participated in the First World War, they would be given a sense of some amount of autonomy after the end of the First World War. Of course, nothing like that happened. And contrary to the expectation of the British press, Indians did not press for any increase in autonomy after the end of the First World War, which was disappointing. But Indian history would have been very different had that been pursued. So then After that, then of course, after the First World War and the armistice in 1919, the British built a war memorial to the Indian soldiers that's called the India Gate in Delhi. And when Indians pressed for more freedom, they suppressed the movement with an iron hand. There was this major debacle in Amritsar on 13th April 1919 called the Jallianwala Bagh, which is a very horrible occurrence in India. And after that, the patience of some Indians ran out, and there was this infamous Chauri Chaura incident in 1922 when some policemen were burnt alive in a police station in Uttar Pradesh. After which Mahatma Gandhi stopped the movement, and then the a revolutionary group of people came up to fight for India's freedom, and they were very brutally crushed. People like Azad and Bhagat Singh and so on, they came up at that time, and they caught the people's imagination at that time, and the Congress Party thought that the initiative was slipping away from it. It was being taken over by these young people. Small they were in number. So when this uprising was quelled, Mahatma Gandhi had the brilliant idea of initiating the Dandi March as a means to getting back the initiative that had been lost in the late 20s. So he did the Dandi March, which is well known, and he walked up to the Gujarat coast and made some salt from the sea, which was then forbidden by the British rule. And then I discussed the politics of Hindu-Muslim divisions, something which had not occurred for a very long time. In fact, I emphasize in the book that in the 19th century, various groups in India lived in much more peace than they did during the British rule, because the British rule had this mechanism of creating disunity among different parts of the population, divide and rule as it was called. But in the 19th century, there were hardly any riots in India, even though Indians was again under foreign occupation. So I discussed that, and I discussed the formation of the International Army by Subhash Chandra Bose, the role of the Quit India movement in 1942, and the final blow to British rule in India coming from the activities of the Indian National Army and the way in which Jawaharlal Nehru was appointed Prime Minister of India, even though he did not have the confidence of the Congress Working Committee. And then I discussed how Patel and some other people brought India together, got more than 500 riyasats to accede to India. And I discussed the problems that have remained after independence, the problems of Jammu and Kashmir, and the problem of Balochistan in Pakistan, the problems that they have with their accession to the to Pakistan. So this is chapter 6. So chapter 7 then is dealing with the structure of, I'll be very brief on this, is dealing with the structure of constitution in India. It describes the executive, judiciary, and legislature, and it describes the distribution of powers, the structure of taxation and public expenditure in India. So these are some of the things which are discussed in detail, and how they have evolved over time. That is also discussed. Finally, in chapter 8 of the first volume, I discuss the prime ministerships of the various individuals who have been Indian prime ministers. So I discuss Nehru and the economic policy that he started, his and mistakes that he made, very severe mistakes that he made in economic policy, which led to India's stunted industrial growth, and which led to India's food problem. And then I discuss India's war with China in 1962, and how India was ill prepared for it. And then I discussed the food problem which persisted during Shastri's prime ministership and part of Indira Gandhi's prime ministership. So, and then I go on to discuss all the other prime ministers, the rule of all the other prime ministers, and how they have affected the Indian economy. There's considerable detail there. I think it's probably best for readers to take a look at it. It's an account of how the Indian economy has developed since 1947. So, so this is the book. So, on the one hand, I have looked at economic and social and political circumstances, and I've always been aware of the fact that India's cultural unity and India's spiritual heritage is key. So, in writing this book, and in fact even before it, I have made a conscious effort to read India's vast, at least the key elements of India's vast spiritual literature. So I have studied, I can't say I have absorbed everything, but I have at least read them. So I have studied the Vedas, I have studied the Upanishads, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana in considerable detail, and also the Guru Granth Sahib, to get a sense of how the Sikh religion and how Sikh thinking has changed in India. So I have brought elements of each of these books into the writing, into an economics and social writing. So it's a new experiment. I hope the readers read these volumes, and I hope they profit from it, they benefit from it. So I stop there.
That's very great. I think thanks Professor Raghvendra Jha for providing us a really great overview of your book, and given a really good introduction to our listeners and viewers. And another thing I would like to ask, for example, Facets of India's Economy and Her Society Volume 1, is there a book is online, available online, or is it available just in the universities if some of the listeners or viewers, they want to have a look around the book?
No, it is available online.
Is it available?
It is definitely available online. There is this is the hard copy of Volume 1, and this is the hard copy of Volume 2. But both of these are available in Kindle edition, so they can be bought at relatively inexpensive prices, and they have actually been bought by, it's doing reasonably well, but I think that I would like to think that there are some important messages in this book, and I do hope that people read these messages, and I hope that they will find them useful.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you very much, Professor Raghvendra Jha, for today's interview session. And thanks everyone. Hope you enjoyed today's talk with Professor Raghvendra Jha. Please subscribe to his YouTube channel, and you will be updated with more recent talks we will be doing on the research work he's doing, and some of the other areas he's trying to do his research work. So thank you very much for your time to all your listeners and viewers, and I hope you will stay in touch, and we will bringing some more work and more interesting talk for you. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jha.
Thank you.